So today, our training, you are in for a treat. Just an amazing instructor who is going to really touch upon a topic that a lot of us don't know much about. Is what do we do? How do we address those people that come to us with disabilities, and what is the language? What are some of the things that we can do to really maximize that comfort, maximize again the inclusivity for them. Housekeeping. Please, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the QA section of Zoom and type in your questions. We will do the best we can to answer them as the training is proceeding. So all the registered attendees will get a copy and of this presentation and resource links. So make sure if you're not registered to, you can put your information in the chat so you can get the copy of this presentation. And you will also receive a certificate with an email within 10 days. So if you have not in about a couple weeks, please reach back out to us and we'll make sure that you get that. All right. I went out of order, but thank you so much. Thank you to the Domestic Violence Council, One Safe Place, the DA's office, and of course, Activating Change for hosting this presentation and allowing us to bring this to you. So our presenter is absolutely fabulous, and I'm going to allow her to introduce herself and let you know about all the wonderful work that she does. Sandra Harrell is a director, field and capacity building, hers of Activating Change. So I'm going to now hand it over to Sandra. Thank you so much for attending and enjoy.
This is Sandra. Claudia, thank you so much, and congratulations on your 4 years of service. I'm sure whoever is going to be filling your shoes will have very big shoes to fill. Hi, everyone. My name is Sandra Harrell. As Claudia mentioned, I'm the Director of Field and Capacity Building with Activating Change, and I've been working at the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and disability for the past 19 years. Prior to that, I worked as an advocate, a community-based advocate at a battered women's shelter and rape crisis program. And I also did work at Vanderbilt University on campus violence against the students and staff at Vanderbilt University. All of that is to say, I started my career really working to address domestic and sexual violence. And it was in 2005, I had an opportunity to join the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault on a project that they called Project Access. And it was the first time that I really began doing work at this intersection of disability and domestic and sexual violence. Prior to that, I felt like I had worked in the community. I had done work sort of at the level of like prevention, and I felt like I knew a lot about domestic and sexual violence at that point. But when I started working at this particular intersection, it really showed me a lot of what I didn't already know. And one of the things that became really crystal clear to me is that the movement that I had sort of dedicated my life to at that point had unintentionally, I believe it was unintentionally, created a lot of barriers to survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors. And so once I began working at this intersection, I knew it was my new life's passion to help advocates and system-based folks be able to better serve survivors with disabilities, because as we'll share today, people with disabilities have really high rates of violence in their lives, particularly sexual violence, and they often have no place to turn post-victimization for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into. That's my dog, Ignatius / Iggy, and he is a very bossy animal. And the last time I did a training, He made it a point of putting his ball under the furniture and barking at me. So I hope that doesn't happen today. But if it does, I apologize in advance, but I will just pause quickly, run and get the ball, and then come back to you. So let's talk about effectively serving survivors with disabilities. And while I'm doing these sort of initial slides, if you're comfortable doing so, it's great to know who is in my audience. So if you don't mind doing like a quick introduction, I know y'all may know each other, but you're new to me. So just to say your name and sort of what hat you're wearing at this particular training. Are you an advocate? Are you law enforcement? Are you in a prosecutor's office? What hat are you wearing today? And I do see that there is a hand raised, but I'll ask Tara to see if there's something that we can help with on that end. So let's get started with today's material. So today we have like 4 major goals here. We really want to make sure that you have some foundational information about victimization of people with disabilities, with more of a focus on sexual assault and domestic violence. We really want you to also be able to understand sort of the experiences that survivors with disabilities have when they try to access healing services in the civil criminal justice systems and what barriers they face. And really, at the end of the day, I always like to provide people with really concrete and practical steps that you can take to begin to enhance your responses and supports to survivors with disabilities. That is, at the end of every one of my days, my goal, that there are more advocates out there, more prosecutors, more law enforcement who have the tools that they need to more effectively respond to survivors with disabilities. So I start all trainings that I do with kind of getting us all on the same page. I want us to have like a shared lexicon when we're talking about disabilities, so that some of you may have a lot of experience with disabilities. Some of you may have very little experience with disabilities. But I'm going to provide you with some basic information so that we at least all have a shared understanding of disability at this point. One of the points that I try to make every time that I get to talk to a group of people is that disability is really a normal part of the human condition. We as a society have done a great deal to marginalize people with disabilities. And so we have treated disability as something outside of the norm of the human condition. But in reality, 1 in 5 people living in the United States has at least one disability. That means, and if we look at sort of the trajectory of like aging, if you live long enough, you are likely going to have a disability at some point in your life, whether that is a temporary disability brought on by an accident or illness, or a disability that you acquire through the aging process. So it is a really normal part of the human condition. And it is also an incredibly broad category. So oftentimes when we think of disability, we're thinking of people with physical disabilities. Possibly we're thinking of people with sensory disabilities. But in reality, it includes people who have cognitive disabilities. And those cognitive disabilities could be the result of something that was present at birth, or it could be the result of like a traumatic brain injury. And so they have information processing is difficult for them. Keeping time is difficult for them. Tracking information might be difficult for somebody with a cognitive disability. Cognitive disabilities don't necessarily mean that you have an intellectual disability. So you can have difficulty tracking information, but not difficulty learning. And intellectual disability is a disability that impacts your ability to learn beyond a certain level. These, again, an intellectual disability is generally something that is present at birth. It could be the result of something like Down syndrome. It could be the result of fetal alcohol syndrome. You can acquire an intellectual disability through certain types of illnesses, though. So it can be acquired, but it's most often present at birth. Physical disabilities are, you can either acquire a physical disability through an accident, through illness, through trauma of some sort. Or be born with a physical disability like cerebral palsy or muscular dystrophy, multiple sclerosis. So, and these are just any disability that impacts somebody's ability, mobility, you know. So it could be a disability that impacts someone's dexterity. It could be a disability that impacts a person's ability to walk, or a person's ability to hold things. So it's a broad range. Even within each of these categories, it's a broad range of different ways that these show up and manifest. And then we also have psychiatric disabilities. This includes everything from anxiety, depression, to bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder. Psychiatric disabilities can be something that impacts a person's day-to-day. It could be something that is under control with medication or therapy. You can have acute instances of when psychiatric disabilities show up. So under tremendous stress, somebody's bipolar disorder may get triggered, or under acute stress, somebody's anxiety that they have totally managed in typical situations, in an acutely stressful situation, such as domestic violence. That anxiety will ramp way up, and being able to help a person, and particularly if that person is in shelter, and having to live in sort of this congregate setting, strangers that they've never met before, being able to manage that anxiety or those stressors becomes really important. And then finally, we talk about sensory disabilities. And these are any disability that impacts a person's any of the 5 senses. Generally, we're talking about hearing or sight when we talk about sensory disabilities, but it also could, you could have a sensory disability that impacts your sense of smell. That is common among people with traumatic brain injuries, or taste. And then for people with spinal cord injury, their sense of touch can also be impacted. So a person with a physical disability may also have a sensory disability. And when we're talking about disability, we are talking about both visible disabilities, those that you can look at someone and because they're using a wheelchair, you know they have a disability. But then you have to know that there are a lot of disabilities that are hidden. And when we get into talking about sort of the societal context in which people with disabilities live, you'll understand that somebody who has a hidden disability may have a lot of motivation to not share that they have that disability. And we are going to take one tiny break for that exact thing I predicted was going to happen. I'm going to go remove the ball from under the couch, and I'll be right back. I apologize. Apologies for that. I would like to point out that he has about 100 balls, but he finds one ball that he gets really attached to at this time of day, and he puts it under furniture and yells at me to come and get it. So any clarifying questions at this point about this category of disabilities that I've just shared with you? You can pop those into the Q&A, or you can put them in the chat if you would like. And I am watching both of those, but I'm going to go ahead and move to our next slide. So there's some key considerations that I encourage you all to sort of try to commit to memory when you're thinking about working with survivors with disabilities. As I've mentioned already, disability is ordinary. We have start the recording. Sorry. So we've treated disability as something extraordinary, something abnormal. But in reality, it is actually really ordinary. It's a normal part of our human condition. And the more we can start treating disability as sort of, really, it's just fairly standard. People have disabilities just like people don't have disabilities. The more that we can treat it like that, the more we begin to allow our service provision to respond to people with disabilities in the same way that we would respond to people without disabilities. In other words, just the fact that the disability is present doesn't cause us anxiety, doesn't make us suddenly think, okay, do I need to call anybody else? A domestic violence survivor with a disability gets the same amount of confidentiality that a domestic violence survivor without a disability would get. It's important to keep in mind that because, as we've covered, disability is such a broad category that simply having a diagnosis will not tell you anything about an individual's experience. If you've met one person with cerebral palsy and that person has mobility difficulties, they may have difficulties with their speech. You might meet another person with cerebral palsy who is able to walk and does not have those same difficulties. If you meet one person who is autistic, they may have, you might find somebody who is autistic whose neurodivergence shows up as being really sensitive to sound and light, and then another person may simply be sensitive to touch or a lack of routine. So asking someone about their diagnosis tells you really very little. It's really more important that you are asking people what accommodations work for them. What sort of modifications can you make to your services and your approach so that the folks who are participating with you in your services or your systems are able to fully participate. And because not all people who have disabilities identify as having a disability, it's even more important that we're not asking questions to have people self-disclose that they have a disability. As I mentioned, people with disabilities are living within a context in which disability has been devalued. The presence of a disability in someone is treated as if that person now has a significant flaw. We have a narrative in our society that people with disabilities are burdensome, require too much help. And so there's a lot of reasons that a person who has a disability might not tell you that they have a disability. Moreover, if you've acquired a disability through aging, you may not see yourself as a person with a disability, right? Like both of my parents have physical disabilities that they've acquired through the aging process. And yet neither one of them want to use assistive devices. My father should be using a walker everywhere he goes. And instead he prefers to use the shopping carts at the stores as something to help him, because he just doesn't see himself as having a disability or as a person with a disability. And why that is important is that someone who doesn't identify as part of the disability community may not be connected to disability organizations in your community. They may not even know what sorts of accommodations might work for them. So while I was saying earlier, like diagnosis doesn't predict your individual experience, you can't always 100% rely on a person to be able to tell you A, B, and C are the accommodations that are going to work for me. You might have to sit with them and say, okay, what do you do at home when you have to use the restroom and you have a standard toilet? What sorts of ways do you, transfer out of bed at home? Really kind of engaging with that individual to figure out how they're coping from day to day, and seeing if you have opportunities to sort of elevate their experience. And as we'll talk about in a few slides from now, ableism shapes the daily lives of people with disabilities in really profound ways. And it creates the conditions in which people with disabilities are targeted for violence and victimization at incredibly high rates. So if, as an organization, as an agency, as an individual, or as a system, you aren't paying attention to the way ableism shows up within your programs, you're doing a disservice. Like, not only is that going to have a negative impact on any survivor who comes through your doors, but you're contributing to, and not intentionally, but you are contributing to the conditions that make it easier for people to harm people with disabilities. And then finally, for this slide, language choice. You'll notice that I am using person first language. So I am talking about people with disabilities. And that comes from a very long struggle that the disability community has had of getting people to move away from language such as the handicapped or the disabled. There's much worse language that is out there. And for a long time, people with disabilities were really organizing around this idea that in order for people to see their humanity, they asked people to use people first language, because if you have to first say that is a person with X, then at least you're acknowledging that they're a person. So that has been sort of the language of choice for the disability community for a really long time. And at the same time, there is a growing group of people within the disability community who use identity first language. So this is particularly true within the autistic community. Many people see autism as part of their identity, and so they will identify as an autistic person. There's a number of people who will say, I'm a disabled person. But one of my recommendations is just to follow what that person uses. So if a person is using person first language, follow that. If someone is using language that is more identity first, follow that. And I would default as an agency to person first language until someone tells you differently. So just a little bit of a caveat about the deaf community, because some deaf and hard of hearing people do not identify as having a disability. Some do. Some deaf and hard of hearing people have acquired single-sided deafness, for instance. They've become hard of hearing through the aging process, and they don't identify as part of like the capital D cultural deaf community. But those who do, it's really important that for those who identify as a member of a cultural and linguistic group versus people with disabilities, that your services, your systems sort of honor that identity. So for this group of people, you would use the capital D deaf to reflect their cultural identification. And some of the ways that you would want to incorporate the deaf community into your own practices is to be thinking about deaf culture and how you can be culturally specific to deaf culture, and recognizing a shared language, shared values, and a shared history among deaf culture, and representing that in your practices. And then finally, for deaf people, their experiences are shaped by autism, which is essentially the belief that being hearing is better than not hearing. And you can see this show up when, for instance, a hearing family has a child who is deaf. And one of the most immediate corrections that or recommendations that might be given to that family or that hearing family is that they get a cochlear implant for their child, for their baby, which is one thing, but there's also a really wonderful and rich community that you can tap into and learn the ASL, really helping that deaf child have a rich and happy life as a deaf child who could at some point in their life decide if and when they want to have a cochlear implant. But that's, autism doesn't operate that way. Autism assumes that anybody who is born deaf is in the negative and should be given hearing, even if that hearing is robotic and it's AI, it's artificial intelligence, it's not real hearing. Autism assumes that that's better than being deaf. And that shows up in a lot of different ways for deaf people, but one of the biggest ways that it shows up is that they have found that that hearing people don't care whether or not they get certain information, and that hearing people will prioritize communicating information in English versus American Sign Language, and just assume that somebody who is fluent in ASL is also fluent in English, even though ASL has nothing in common with English. It's not like a version of English turned into sign. It has its, it's a totally different language. And so a lot of deaf people will talk about how they don't benefit from incidental learning because everyone's talking and using hearing as a way of transmitting information, and deaf people aren't overhearing any of that because they can't. And how that lack of information, that lack of language access really shapes their ability to participate fully in our society. And then once they are, targeted for domestic violence or sexual violence, and they're trying to access services, that lack of attention to providing information in American Sign Language means that for many deaf people who show up to shelter, they get maybe 1 or 2 hours of communication access while they're at the shelter, maybe 1 or 2 hours a week. And for a lot of deaf people or deaf survivors, they will leave and go back to and return to the situation in which they have communication access versus being completely isolated in shelter. So just a few other things about society's treatment of people with disabilities that I think is really important to contextualize sort of the lives of people with disabilities and to better understand sort of the underlying psychology at play for people with disabilities. For a really, really long time, when somebody had a disability, it was treated as if it was a punishment from God, that there was something that either they've done, their family did, that resulted in this person having a disability. And as time moved on and people became a little bit kinder about stuff like that, society started treating people with disabilities as people deserving of pity or charity. And so you will see a lot of charities that came up around people with disabilities, trying to help people with disabilities. And then more to the current day, we have more of a medical model of disability that is looking at disability as something that needs to be fixed. So I am tired of talking for now. So I want to ask you from the audience, sort of all of these models, sort of what is the overarching message that people with disabilities are learning through these different models of how we treat people with disabilities in our society? So thinking about the religious or moral model that your disability is a curse from God, or the pity/charity model, which people with disabilities have to be helped, or the medical model, people with disabilities should be fixed. Thanks, Lori. Something is wrong with you. Overarchingly, the message, no matter how you come at and which model you come at this with, is that something is inherently wrong with you. Remember, we talked about how disability is actually really a normal part of the human condition, but we have put systems and narratives in place that make people with disabilities feel like they are out of the ordinary, they're abnormal, that they are burdens to society, that they are not wanted in society. And thank you, Dan. Dana is saying that these models also sort of carry with them the implicit bias of helping professionals in society at large. And all of these sort of models have contributed to ableism in our society. So to understand ableism, it's really just, again, this notion that not having a disability is superior to having a disability. And when you believe that, when that is sort of the overarching value system in a society, you create sort of different ways to keep people with disabilities out of society. And some of that is like your built environment. This is an image of a person using a wheelchair who is, possibly wanting to go to the courthouse and is confronted with steps. So the built environment is often a way to keep people with disabilities from being able to participate fully in society. But there's also elements of like our communication environment. I mentioned, for deaf people in domestic violence programs, they may get 1 or 2 hours a week of communication access through an American Sign Language interpreter. It just creates marginalization, keeps deaf people from participating in those healing services. There are, ways that we marginalize people with disabilities from a very early age. If you have children with disabilities, that a lot of times they are routed through special education. My niece teaches in special education, and she's in a small town in Louisiana, and she's got one child that she works with all day, and that child has to go to a separate lunchtime, separate PE. He's completely isolated with her in a classroom. I mean, he doesn't get to participate in any of the activities of the other kids in that particular situation. So lots of different ways, either through our built environment or our policy environment or communication environment, and oftentimes our attitudinal environment, we are marginalizing people with disabilities. And it's really effective, because then we don't have to think about people with disabilities, because they're not able to fully participate in our society. And if we're not thinking about people with disabilities, we don't have to create materials for people with disabilities. We don't have to change our practices to ensure that they are effectively responsive to people with disabilities. We don't have to raise money to change the entryway of our building because we've effectively kept people with disabilities from being able to fully participate. So that's one way that ableism shows up. Another way that it shows up is through exploitation of their labor, exploitation of their bodies. This is an image of a sheltered workshop, which, you know, one of the results of marginalization is that a lot of times people with disabilities aren't at the table when public policy is being set. And a very clear manifestation of that is the fact that up until 2020, people with disabilities were allowed to be paid a sub-minimum wage for their labor. Oftentimes at a place like a sheltered workshop, which was considered like people created sheltered workshops to be able to employ people with disabilities. And then as a matter of public policy, we were like, well, if you're doing that, you shouldn't have to pay them quite as much. But a person's labor, how is one person's labor less than another person's labor? We rectified that in 2020. So, you know, just a few years ago, did we decide that the labor of a person with a disability was as valuable as a person without? In addition to that, there's lots of different ways that people with disabilities are sort of corralled into the lower economic classes in our society. So if you have a disability that's present at birth and your family applies for disability benefits, there's a lot of different limits to how much you can earn, how much the family can earn before you lose those disability benefits. And I get it. You know, that's the structure of our society. We only provide benefits to people who are most in need, but those disability benefits pay for things like personal care attendance. They pay for things like medications. And so putting a cap on how much can be earned, it means that that person who could be a productive worker with the help of a personal care attendant loses that personal care attendant if they in fact become a productive worker. So that's a way that we also exploit people with disabilities, just by limiting how much they can earn. And in that context, and I know this is about domestic violence and sexual assault, but in that context, it is really easy to traffic people with disabilities, because for sex trafficking or for labor trafficking, because if you can not earn a lot of money, you know, that's documented, but you can earn money under the table, then someone can continue to pay you a sub-minimum wage. They can tell you can earn more money through like sex work than you can in any other place, and it won't go on the books. So you'll have a better quality of life through this sex work. So it creates a condition for that is really problematic. And I do say that there's a question about how much a person can make to still receive their disability. And unfortunately, my answer is it depends. It depends on all sorts of things, like what configuration of disability benefits they're receiving. It depends on, you know, are they getting a housing benefit? Do they get SSDI or do they get SSI? And then where they live and how much, like we tried to answer this question, basically, is what I'm trying to tell you. And it was largely like, you know, some people could get a lump sum payment of $600 twice a year, but it had to happen at a very particular time of the year. We do have a compensation tip sheet that we created based on the analysis that we did, which I will pop into the chat in just a minute. but there's not a straightforward answer. There's a lot of additional analysis that you would have to do. So if you're working with somebody with a disability and you know that they have SSI or SSDI, this tip sheet will help you ask them the right questions to prevent them from losing their benefits. But we can't give you like, oh, you can make $200 and that's okay. We wouldn't want to lead you the wrong order. And the second question is, who would we refer a client to in order to clarify this for individuals? You know, you could put them in touch with their local Social Security benefits office, but like I said, let me pop this tip sheet into there, because a lot of the times it's like having a conversation with the individual first, because referring them out to disability focused programs could open them up to mandatory reporting. So there's a little bit of calculus that you have to make there as well. But I'll get to more of these questions towards the end, and I promise to get that tip sheet into the chat very quickly. Okay, another way that ableism shows up is by rendering people with disability as powerless. There are very specific rules within individualized education plans that allow, for instance, restraints to be used on children with disabilities. There's a lot of but then that, so there's physical ways that we render people with disabilities powerless, but we also make it really difficult to vote. For instance, a lot of our voting voting places are not accessible to people with disabilities. You know, I know we've seen the imagery of past presidential elections where we have lines and lines and lines of people standing in horrendous weather waiting to vote. That's just not something that people with disabilities are really able to do. And so they're not able to vote. That is a very clear way that we are rendering people with disabilities powerless. And then there's other policy things that we do to render people with disabilities powerless. If a person with a disability is deemed to have capacity issues by a court, we put a stand-in decision maker into their life. You can become somebody's guardian or conservator over a person with a disability. And you can have conservatorship over their finances, or you can have conservatorship over the person and make every decision about that person's life. And sure, a lot of people who act in those roles are doing it because they are very concerned about their loved one, and they're making really good decisions in those roles, and they're helping that person through supported decision making. And there are people who actually use that power to gain access to a person's finances, to their disability benefits, to their medication. So we've created a legal way for somebody to really exploit and take away a person's ability to live on their own. We also do this through other weird policies that I've seen in different states. One state's licensing agency for personal care attendants had a rule on the book that if a PCA, a personal care attendant, is someone who comes into a person's home and helps them with activities of daily life. So it's helping them to get ready for work by bathing them, getting them dressed, helping them to get in their chair. They might go with them throughout the day, but usually it's morning and afternoons and evenings. And if that PCA finds out that there's domestic violence in the home in this particular state for this particular licensing agency, the PCA is withdrawn from the home without anything else happening, except maybe a mandatory report, which is another way that we've rendered people with disabilities powerless, because we've assumed that somebody with a disability can't simply reach out for help in a domestic violence situation without bringing a new sort of bureaucracy into their lives, whether they want it or not. So it's a strange combination of things that all have created a situation in which violence and abuse happens with at tremendous rates and with relative impunity. In fact, a lot of times people with disabilities who are abused, they never see the light of justice. They never get the healing services. And violence is used against people with disabilities at really, really high rates. Don't know why that is there, but that was just a repeat slide, y'all. So let's talk about these rates of disability. I say all of this with the caveat that the research that we have is incredibly flawed. The research on abuse in the lives of people with disabilities has conflated a few things. It's conflated the types of abuse, right? So when we see victimization in the lives of people with disabilities, it's like violent assault, armed robbery, simple assault, robbery without the arm, and then sexual violence. And so we really don't have a good sense of like domestic violence, like what's happening for people with disabilities and domestic violence. We know that there are really high rates of sexual violence, but we don't have as much information about domestic violence. And a little bit of that is informed by ableism as well, because there's almost this presumption that people with disabilities aren't going to be in intimate relationships where domestic violence could occur. And in fact, a lot of literature about domestic violence in the lives of people with disabilities is focused on violence committed by a personal care attendant, not an intimate romantic partner. But the other thing that gets conflated in the research is the category of disability. Like this, people with physical disabilities and people with intellectual disabilities have very different experiences in the world. And that when we do research on people with disabilities, it's just like, if you have a disability and you've ever experienced violence. And so it's really hard to tease out what the reality is. And in some ways, I don't think this is intentional. It's just the way that, ableism, all the isms work. They're sort of invisible behind the scenes. And we make this sort of decisions on automatic pilot and based on everything that we know and learn. And so we don't think to disentangle this category of disability and to really hone in, okay, what's happening in the lives of people with physical disabilities when it comes to domestic violence. All of that said, this is what we do know. We know that women who have experienced intimate partner violence are more than twice as likely to also report a disability. We know that men with disabilities experience much higher rates of sexual violence in their lifetimes compared to men without disabilities. We know that nearly half of people with developmental disabilities have been assaulted 10 or more times in their lives. And we know that at least 20% of deaf adults report having experienced physical abuse by an intimate partner, and 15% have experienced forced sex in an intimate partner relationship. So we know that this isn't even really representative of how often it is happening. If I were to base it anecdotally on all the people with disabilities that I've worked with over the last 20 years, I rarely have worked with somebody who doesn't have an account of sexual or domestic violence in their life. It is just common in the lives of people with disabilities. And I make this point because, everything we've talked about so far, domestic and sexual violence, people working in the space of domestic and sexual violence, we often don't see people with disabilities, or we're thinking, this isn't something that is that we see a lot of. So why are we spending so much time today talking about it? And it's because if you're not seeing these people, it's not that it's not happening. It's that they're not coming to you, that they don't think of you as a resource. Something is happening where your services aren't reaching them. It's not because violence isn't a part of their day-to-day living and lives. It's that your services, your message isn't reaching them, and it needs to, because they are a core part of the survivors that we need to be serving as part of the domestic and sexual violence movement. So I'll get off that high horse for a second, come back down to y'all and talk a little bit about some of the perpetrators and the lives of people with disabilities. Like people without disabilities, the vast majority of the perpetrators are known to people with disabilities. So the people who are abusing them are people that they know. The difference, what's a little bit unique here, is that a lot of times they are known to them because of their disabilities. So 44% of people who report abuse report being abused by personal caregivers, attendants, or people who are drivers of accessible transportation. So this is a pretty significant number of people who are being targeted through employment, either as a personal caregiver or somebody who's providing an attendant services for people with disabilities, driving. And then of course you also have the people, the family members, partners, like your intimate partners, and then just your typical acquaintances. But it's important because a lot of the resources that we use when we're talking to people about domestic violence, and we're talking about sort of the dynamics of power and control, and the lives of somebody with a disability, don't reflect the different types of tactics that a caregiver might use, or it doesn't necessarily, like when we're talking about sexual violence, we might be talking about violence that is happening when you are alcohol facilitator, drug facilitated sexual violence, or date rape. We might talk about those sorts of things, but we don't talk about you are on a paratransit or a fixed route transportation route, and you take the same route every day to the point where the driver really knows your routines, and they know who's going to meet you at the end of the day, or who's not going to meet you, whether or not you're going to have to go somewhere on your own, and whether or not they have time to assault you while you were on that bus. Our literature doesn't reflect that. And that's part of why we need to be aware of sort of the unique contexts in which people with disabilities are experiencing violence, and the unique people who are targeting them for violence, so that our resources reflect those sorts of realities. And then a few other things that are going on for people with disabilities that impact their ability to either identify that something is happening to them that they would want to reach out for help around, or kind of create barriers to them being able to do that. One of them is a real systematic denial of information about sex and healthy relationships. Part of this is informed by ableism in and of itself, this assumption that people with disabilities are permanent children. In fact, we use a term called infantilization, where we treat people with disabilities as permanent children. And just like we won't necessarily talk to 3 or 4-year-olds about setting boundaries in their sexual relationship with their partner, we're not talking to people with disabilities around that. And so as people with disabilities, or like kids with disabilities, are growing up in our school systems, and they're being kept separate from all of the sort of mainstream information that we might be sharing around healthy relationships, healthy sexuality in our schools. kids with disabilities aren't getting that information. And then as they grow, into adults, they don't have the same tools. We work with a survivor with a physical disability. She writes poetry. She's brilliant, but when she was sexually assaulted, she didn't know how to describe what had happened to her because she was never given the vocabulary to talk about, like, this was without my consent. She wasn't, like, no one told her about sort of pushing those boundaries in the way that, some people will really groom somebody for abuse. And so when she reached out for help after her sexual assault, she was encouraged to use lube next time so it wouldn't hurt so much. That was the response that she got because she couldn't articulate it in the same way that many of us are able to articulate it. We, of course, talked about sort of the systematic oppression of people with disabilities that create the conditions for violence to just run rampant in their lives. And part of why I keep talking about that is that there's a message that people with disabilities receive when they are targeted for violence over and over and over in their lives. There's a message. And anybody that wants to volunteer what you think that message is in the chat, I welcome you to do that. But think about survivors without disabilities that you've worked with that have maybe been in 3 or 4 different violent relationships. What is their key belief that they have? What is one of the outposts that might be in their head as they come into service with you and they're in their 3rd violent relationship? What is something that they might believe deeply if they've had 3 experiences of that they deserve it, but also that it's something about them, right? Like, a lot of people with disabilities truly believe that the reason they are being targeted is because of the presence of a disability versus these conditions that we have created around disability that allow them to be targeted. And so you almost, if you're an advocate or a therapist, you almost have to do that more fundamental work with them to help get that out of their head so they can begin the healing process. So they don't think, yeah, no matter what I do in this society, I am going to be hurt. And it's because of who I am. It's not because of society, it's because of who I am. That is some of the more fundamental work that you have to really be able to engage in with them because of how deep the oppression runs in them. And then another dynamic that you'll encounter for people with disabilities that you may not encounter with, for other folks is the lack of confidentiality. So in particularly when we're thinking about like deaf communities, many deaf communities within a community are very small and close knit. And so they may not feel like they can go into shelter and have one of the American Sign Language interpreters that interprets for their church services be able to interpret for them, talking about how their partner, emotionally and sexually abuses them. That doesn't feel confidential anymore. In the same way that you and I, one-on-one, could have that conversation, and I could have a reasonable guarantee that no one else is gonna, you're not gonna go off and tell everybody about my personal experience. You've got somebody who's an intermediary with communication right there. And while ASL interpreters absolutely operate under a code of ethics, you can see how a survivor might not want to take that chance. So that can become a real barrier to being able to disclose. We've talked about guardianship. Guardians can actually prevent people, like if they have guardianship of the person, they can prevent somebody from participating in services without the guardian getting to know everything that is being shared. And, you know, in the chat, maybe share why you think that might be problematic. And I'm going to look for that compensation tip sheet while I wait for your responses in the chat. Why might it be problematic that a guardian gets access to everything that is shared during a counseling session, an advocacy session? Yeah, either you go, they might be the abuser. Thanks, Kelly. Yes, Kelly and Tara both are on it. They could be the person who is abusing that individual, and therefore everything they share in that session could be more fodder for why they hurt them. And for everyone who wants that compensation tip sheet, I'm putting it into the chat right now. And then that is a URL directly to the compensation tip sheet, but the endofusepwd.org, we have tons of resources on there for serving survivors with disabilities. So I encourage you to explore a little bit more closely. And then another barrier to confidentiality for people with disabilities are mandatory reporting policies. So I know y'all are all familiar with mandatory reporting of child abuse. There are similar mandatory reporting policies around abuse of older adults and people with disabilities. It's called mandatory reporting of vulnerable adults. And what's problematic is that a lot of times they're very, very sweeping. So there are a lot of people with disabilities who are fully capable of deciding who they want to know about the abuse that they've experienced. They are fully capable of working with an advocate, working with a prosecutor, working with law enforcement to be able to pursue whatever path they want to pursue for keeping themselves safe and for seeking justice if that's what they want. But mandatory reporting requirements assume that they can't do that, that they need help, that if they report violence in their lives and to a disability agency, for instance, that disability agency, by virtue of either the state statute on mandatory reporting or their licensing agency, has to then report that disclosure, even if the person is sitting there with their disability agency folks that they've worked with for years, and they're just like, you know, Ted has been acting awful lately, and he's just calling me names, and you know, he's moving my wheelchair right from out of my reach, and I spent a whole day just like sitting in a chair because I couldn't reach my wheelchair. Just sharing information and seeking some help and guidance, and hopefully a warm referral to a domestic violence advocate, that could result in a mandatory report. And it doesn't like there's, yeah, I know when I was working with survivors in direct services, one of the things that I had to keep in mind is that oftentimes their primary emergency wasn't the violence. Their primary emergency was often, I need housing, or I need to be in a location where my kids can continue to go to their same school, or I need to be able to get to work. Their primary emergency wasn't often the violence. And for people with disabilities, oftentimes their thing that is like front and center for them is they don't want to lose their independence. They have fought for that independence. And what can happen when somebody else comes into play that they haven't chosen is that independence can be taken away from them. We work with a self-advocate, someone with an intellectual disability, and she had fought long and hard to get her own apartment. And she was super excited about her having her own apartment. And she had a little job, and she'd ride her bike to her job every day. And she got into a bike accident. And that freaked her parents out, and her parents fought for and won guardianship over her. Now imagine if that same person had experienced sexual assault, and that word gets out about that to somebody that doesn't know what that person really wants and needs. So it's not that mandatory reporting on its face is bad. It's the way the laws and statutes are often written. It's the fact that licensing agencies can make it even more sweeping and not necessarily in the interest of the individuals with disabilities, but more to protect the agencies themselves from, any sort of litigation. And the response is often deleterious to the life that this person has built. So keeping that in mind as you're venturing into this world of working with survivors with disabilities, if you are a DV program or a sexual assault program, it's a good idea to take a look at your mandatory reporting statute and your policy that is in place and account for, okay, do you maybe have privilege that other people don't have? Many states have afforded advocates privilege that other entities don't have. And then you have to have a calculus in place of okay, if I have this privilege and I'm able to work with this person without making a mandatory report, who all can we involve without triggering a mandatory report? And that's the reason I was saying we don't necessarily want to, refer them out to a disability program right away, because if they find out that they're working with a domestic violence program, that could trigger a mandatory report. Okay, I'm going to look at the Q&A box. I do see that there's a question about sharing the citations for the stats, and I absolutely will share those with Tara to send out to all of you afterwards. Other things that happen for people with disabilities that don't necessarily happen for survivors without disabilities is a real fear of institutionalization, not necessarily being institutionalized, but being moved into a nursing home facility. This is the whole point of they don't want to lose their independence. And so if talking about what is happening to them would trigger a mandatory report, they may not talk about what is happening to them. The loss of personal care, I've touched upon that. There's a significant lack of accessible transportation in communities. I mean, every community. We have worked with over 150 communities across the country. We've worked with, more metropolitan areas like Boston. We've worked with rural areas in Kentucky and Louisiana. We've worked even in San Diego, and every single needs assessment that we have conducted in those communities, one of the main issues for survivors with disabilities is a lack of accessible transportation. So something to keep in mind is when you have limited accessible transportation and that accessible transportation is on a fixed route and a fixed schedule, it makes it really hard to safety plan, because the person will know that you use accessible transportation and will know when that accessible transportation runs, and it's a very easy way to target someone for violence. We also see that sometimes they don't know what they've experienced is abusive or criminal. And, I've shared examples of that already. And again, may have experienced violence throughout their lives by multiple perpetrators, which again makes them believe that the problem is within themselves and not within the society that they live. I was going to say this at the beginning, but then I got distracted by my dog. But I tend to, I know I'm bumming y'all out, but I promise you we end on a high note of like stuff that you can actually put in place to solve some of these things. So I have a handful of slides to continue with the bumming out session, but then we're going to end on our more aspirational slides of ways that you as an individual, as an agency, can tomorrow start doing things differently to help survivors with disabilities in your community. So some of the barriers that we see is that disability organizations are not equipped to address victimization or support survivors. I've talked about that a lot already. Their primary response to disclosures of violence in the lives of the people they serve is mandatory reporting, and that's not an effective response. And it actually creates a barrier to someone with a disability talking to a trusted person who's often at the disability agency about something that is happening in their life, because that trusted person then has to do a mandatory report. And then we see that our traditional victim service organizations are inaccessible. I worked at a shelter in Louisiana that was, just like it was a row of former government buildings, and they were free to us or cheap. And, we did our best, but we had cinder block walls, and we had steps leading up to the front door, narrower doorways. And then we, as advocates, because we wanted to make it feel more homey, started bringing in like rugs and plants and, floor lamps. And sometimes we were putting those in places that would create barriers. So you often don't get a choice of like what building you're working out of, but you can make some choices within that building to make them more accessible. And you can create accessible pathways through your policies and procedures, through your communications, even through training of your staff, so their attitudes just make people with disabilities feel more welcome. And then there are significant barriers within our related systems. Adult Protective Services, which is where we make our mandatory reports to, oftentimes have been trained around working with people like older adults, not necessarily working with people who are deaf-blind or working with somebody who has a disability that impacts their communication, or working with somebody who uses different sort of assistive technology to participate in society. And so that can be a barrier to them knowing, like they might have an assumption that somebody who's using a communication board to communicate with you isn't able to navigate the world on their own, and they might recommend like having that person go into a nursing home or a group home. In the criminal justice system, there's a variety of different ways that people with disabilities don't get adequate sort of responses. A big way is believing that a person with a disability wouldn't make a credible witness. And a lot of that is informed by, you're talking to the person and maybe they're not able to tell their story in a way that makes sense to you, or maybe they're not using the right language in telling their story, and so you're not picking up on that. They're telling you that somebody is sexually abusing them, or that their partner, they might say things like I said earlier about, I mean, gosh, like my wheelchair was like 5 feet from me, but it was 5 feet from me and I couldn't get to it. And so I stayed in bed all day, and that caused me to have, a different like a negative response to my medication, and then by the time he got home, I wasn't feeling great at all. I hadn't made dinner, and he got annoyed by that. Maybe they're not saying anything that sounds criminal, and so the cop's just like, well, it sounds like you need to have a conversation with your husband. And then the husband or partner might be able to better talk the language of the systems, and therefore they're able to mitigate. Oh yeah, and if we think of people with disabilities as burdens, he can play on that big time. The abuser can play on that big time and be like, I mean, I go to work all day and I come home and I have to help, and I forgot. I mean, her wheelchair was over there. I was just rushing out the door this morning. I'm so sorry. And then it goes no further than that. So anyways, there's significant barriers through all of those. And I'm seeing that Lori is saying in the chat, one of the primary misconceptions that prevails amongst our multidisciplinary partners / systems is that people with disabilities aren't capable of providing reliable history, aren't reliable reporters, and somehow therefore not credible. And Lori is saying they are very capable if they are interviewed by someone who is trained, knowledgeable, patient, and trauma informed. Absolutely. Thank you, Lori. Being not only trauma informed, but disability informed, so having the ability to match a person's vocabulary and really establish that credibility by saying, every single time they refer to X, that has meant this. And so while they may not use the same vocabulary as the rest of us, that they have consistently used that word to describe X, so being trauma informed and also disability informed, so that you're able to really effectively provide that accommodation and then tailor the way that you talk with people based on the fact that many people with disabilities have been denied information that people without disabilities got just through incidental learning. As I was on that previous slide, I was just like, I always do this. I get way ahead of myself. So I've already covered a lot of this. We basically have physical barriers in domestic and sexual violence programs, oftentimes in healthcare settings, in criminal justice settings. There are communication barriers and attitudinal barriers. And then importantly, service providers often just lack knowledge of disability in general. And what I have seen in working with communities who are just early on in their work around disability is that there's almost like a panic that happens, that they're going to mess something up, that they're going to do something wrong, that they're, if they say the wrong word, that it's going to ruin the relationship. And honestly, that panic is more of a barrier than you not having all the right language, being able to sit with somebody with a disability and just treat them as if it's any other survivor. And you make mistakes, you learn from them, it's fine. But when you are afraid to engage, that's where more harm happens, because then they don't have anywhere else to go. And then there are times that policies may prevent survivors with disabilities from using services. And I don't know if this would be applicable to any of your programs, but it's important to go back and check your eligibility policies. It's important to make sure that there's nothing in your eligibility policies that suggests that somebody has to be able to do things completely independently in order to participate in your services, because somebody that may live independently through support from others. And therefore they may feel or your policies may prevent them from being able to come in if they require a personal care attendant for their assistance with daily living. Just take a look at eligibility policies within your programs. I know when I worked at the shelter, we had, it was a requirement that everybody sign up for chores within the program. I am hoping that is not still the situation, because we had problems with that long before I engaged in work around disability. But if that is still happening, I use this as an example from my own experiences, I can imagine that people felt like I can't contribute, and that's embarrassing, and therefore, have a shorter stay because they just feel like, gosh, I'm constantly having to not be able to contribute to this thing that everybody else is contributing to, and therefore feel bad about that and leave. So policies may very explicitly prevent survivors from using your services, or by way of not accounting for disability in your policies, that might sort of send an implicit message of like, you're not really welcome here. Talked about all of this already, other than one thing to know about disability programs is that many disability programs have as like a core value that they will serve anyone with a disability. And so there is a high likelihood that disability programs are serving both abusers and survivors. And they don't necessarily account for that in their policies. Again, because their primary response to disclosures of violence is a mandatory report. But all of you in the domestic violence world can see how problematic it would be if you had both an abuser and a survivor going to the same disability program, and word gets out that the survivor has said anything about what is happening at home. That could be a really volatile situation. If the survivor wants to leave, but they are still requiring services from that disability program, well, that abuser knows exactly where to find that person, and the disability program won't say no to the abuser coming in. So it's a problem we've been working to solve with the programs that participate with us, but it's an enduring challenge. And again, I've mentioned already about transportation. Some specific barriers around serving deaf survivors. Mentioned the community of ASL interpreters is often small and tight knit, but a lot of times, because disability programs don't recognize the deaf community as being part of a cultural and linguistic minority, they consider them as part of the disability community. They don't necessarily have a strong connection to the deaf community, and the deaf community doesn't have a strong connection to them. And then the deaf services in your community may be focusing exclusively on communication access versus sort of the full range of violence and abuse that might happen for a deaf survivor. So the deaf program can attend to the victimization that they're experiencing. And then we've already talked about some of the barriers that are in place for it within shelter, including the lack of communication access, but even accessing services. A lot of times we're still accessing services initially over the phone. And the deaf community, when they have to engage with hearing people over the telephone, they use video relay services. And I imagine that a crisis line worker who gets a phone call and they're not familiar with the way that VRS works, they might think, I can't talk to you, I need to talk to the other person. So like making sure that our crisis line workers are trained in working with video relay services is key to getting that initial access into the domestic violence programs. And then also building relationships with deaf advocates or certified deaf interpreters in your community. These may be very limited. There are not a lot of deaf advocacy programs across the country. But in San Diego, I'm sure there are. And if not in San Diego, in nearby areas, it's a great way, like building those sorts of relationships can help you to provide direct access to support versus having the support come through a hearing person through an ASL interpreter. So here's where I stop bumming y'all out. Okay, I'm looking at our comment in the chat. Alicia's saying, when I think of barriers to access services and healing, I tend to only recognize those with physical or sensory disabilities, and therefore easier to address in making changes. How do we recognize barriers for those that have unseen disabilities or mental disabilities? You know, that's what we're getting to right now, Alicia, and then I'll talk more about that on each of these slides. But yeah, I think a lot of what programs can do is begin to be more proactive about working with survivors with disabilities, kind of, again, assuming that if you have a community of people who are targeted for violence at very, very high rates, those people should be able to access your services. So this start with a dialogue, and y'all are doing this today. There are 73 people in our webinar today. This webinar is being recorded. So, if this is something that you wanted to bring back to your agency, your staff, that's something that you could do. If you wanted to invite me to come in and talk, I don't charge. This isn't work that I do because I want to self-promote us or act like myself or activating change. We do it because we know there's a dire need in communities for this information. So, you can bring us in and just start having a conversation with your staff. What are we noticing on our team? Are we noticing that we feel able? Do you feel like if we had people with disabilities coming in right now that you wouldn't have everything that you needed to be able to effectively serve them? If not, what do you need? How can we make that happen? How can we begin to address the challenges that you as an advocate might be experiencing? Is that through training? Do we need to develop some resources? Do we need to look at our policies and procedures? It's just important to just start talking about it. And I say talk about it. Don't keep it up here. Like, you've got people at the shelter who might be working the overnight shifts, and they might be the ones who have some really key information for you about like how challenging it is to interact with somebody who needs an ASL interpreter at 12:30 at night. You can't get an ASL interpreter, and they don't know how to get an ASL interpreter, and they see that person like so afraid and terrified, but they have no way of communicating. That person who's working that overnight shift might very well be the one who can tell you how frustrating folks find it that you don't have an accessible bathroom on the first floor. They'll talk to everybody, get people sort of thinking about like serving deaf people and survivors with disabilities now, and start to begin to address kind of their own knowledge gaps, your policy gaps, your resource gaps, so that as people with disabilities start coming through your doors, you feel more comfortable, you feel more competent around being able to serve them. I want to go back to Alicia's question right here, because another important component of your services, and something that you can start working on right now, is how you ask people, like during intake, is there anything you need to better participate in our services? Here's a range of services that we provide. Is there anything that you need? Sometimes we call these accommodations, sometimes we call them a modification, because a lot of times those invisible disabilities, people aren't going to say, well, yeah, I have a mental health disability and stress triggers it. They're not going to tell you that because there's so much stigma attached to this. But they might say, if there's any way for me to have a quieter room, like any part of the shelter that is sort of more away from the noise, that would be amazing. And that might open it up for them for you to say, like, you do that for them, and they may come back and be like, that's really helpful, because something I didn't want to tell you, but I do have an anxiety disorder, and like loud noises really get to me. Or I am, I've been diagnosed as being autistic. And like when there's a lot of people in my space, I find that very, very disorienting. So like asking questions at intake, and then throughout your process with them, like if you do weekly advocacy sessions or support group, always having a way to check in on, is there anything you need to be able to fully participate? I don't recommend asking people if they need an accommodation. That may not register with a lot of people. If they are somebody who's loud and proud and part of the disability community, they're going to tell you anyways. But if they're not, and they're like sort of, they've always flown under the radar around it, that language isn't going to resonate with them. And it might even feel like you're asking it to trap them. So asking, what do you need? Are there any change in modifications you can use? Like, hey, for instance, I know sometimes we've had to help people get like equipment, like a walker or a cane, because they have to leave it at home. Is that something that you might need? But really, just doing good advocacy and orienting it around people with disabilities need our services. And so we're going to ask questions in different ways that are disability informed. Another thing, yes, correct. Alicia is saying, I think that's because asking for accommodations may seem like they are taking up too much space or too needy. Yes, if you've been treated like you are a burden to society, and people aren't offering you accommodations, offering you like straight up, we do this for everyone, we want to know if there's anything that you need, then they're not going to necessarily feel like they can ask, and they'll leave before they ask. Another thing that you can do is conduct an accessibility review. And a lot of times people will limit their access review to their physical environment, so their built environment. But say that's not something, like, you already know that you are in an inaccessible building. You already know y'all got problems, and conducting the review like tomorrow is only going to stress out your leadership or your board of directors. There's not a lot you can do about that. You can look at your training environment. You can look at your information environment. A lot of times making changes to policies and practices don't cost a lot of money, and you can begin to shift and change those different environments while building a culture of accessibility within your agency and like your board of directors or whomever your leadership is, so that eventually you can get to the physical environment. We're all aware that like making changes to the physical environment is costly sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's moving a plant. Sometimes it's pulling up a rug that is a trip hazard. Sometimes it's taking that entryway shelf out of the hallway, because doing so creates the exact right 36 inches that you need to be accessible to a wheelchair. But a lot of times saying we're going to conduct an access review is an immediate fear trigger for leadership. So you might want to just start in places that feel like less likely to result in costly changes. And then importantly, begin to partner with disability and deaf organizations. There are all sorts of different organizations in different communities. If you've come away from this and you're like, we need to do better. I'm working with people with intellectual disabilities. A good place to start to research in your community would be your local ARC. Local ARCs often run self-advocacy chapters. Self-advocates are people with intellectual disabilities who've been trained to sort of be in leadership positions, to advocate on their own behalf. And so you can begin to build a relationship with those self-advocacy chapters who would be a source of incredible information for you about how to work with people with intellectual disabilities. If you've come away from this and you're like, yeah, we have a large deaf and hard of hearing community in our area, you might want to begin building relationships with your deaf and hard of hearing commissions, your interpreting agencies in your area, interpreters, individual interpreters. You might open up. I saw the beautiful training that y'all are doing in Spanish. You could have an entire training that you're providing, like a volunteer training that you're providing to the deaf community, where you have ASL interpreters there. Here you're building relationships with the deaf community and relationships with individual interpreters at the same time. So lots of ways to begin building those sorts of relationships. Mental health associations, mental health providers in your area, your community mental health providers, get to know them, table at their events, invite them to table at your events, get to know them, and begin the process of building those relationships. Every single state has a protection and advocacy organization. Protection and advocacy organizations, a lot of times now, it'll be like Disability Rights California, but every single state has one, and they're really great organizations to partner or to begin to build a relationship with, because they're charged with investigating abuse of people with disabilities. That's part of their mission. So it's a good organization to begin to, hey, I'd like to just get to know what y'all do. And I say all of this with the caveat of what I said earlier is not all of these programs are going to be trauma informed. Many of these programs will have sort of an immediate sort of, oh yeah, we have mandatory reporting, and they have been so entrenched and immersed in mandatory reporting, they are not questioning it. They're not going to wonder if it could be a problem. Or they might think safety is getting the person out of the relationship versus doing some safety planning while they're in the relationship. And that they might think, they might have beliefs about people in violent relationships that are victim blaming. So all of that is to say, don't leave your own knowledge and expertise at the door when you begin to build these relationships, and don't commit right away. Just like you would say to anybody who is newly dating someone, you kind of want to get to know these organizations before you get into a longer term commitment with them. One caveat there would be deaf-specific domestic violence programs. If you have a deaf advocacy organization in your area, you could be pretty sure that they are already working at the intersection of domestic violence and the deaf community, and so they're a great organization to go full in with. Independent living centers are another great agency to know that you want to have a relationship with. The extent of the relationship might be informed by sort of their own values around and their own openness to learning about being trauma informed. But independent living centers have a wealth of resources that including auxiliary aids and services that they can lend you in a pinch. And if you have that relationship and that 1230 call comes in and you need to get, a raised toilet to go over the standard toilet just for the night, they're the people that can help you get that. So they're a great agency to have a relationship with, again, knowing the extent of which is going to be informed by sort of their orientation and values. And then Edna is asking about serving people who have vision disabilities and employment supports. You have an incredible Society for the Blind in California. The Society for the Blind in Sacramento has actually been a part of the disability grant program for a number of years, Edna. So I would start with maybe. Let me put my email in the chat, Edna, and if you want, you can reach out to me and I can make an introduction to Sherry over there, and who can maybe get you in touch with somebody who's more local to San Diego is the long and short of that. But they're a society, like they're very well resourced, and a lot of what they focus on is employment support. So that would be a great first place to go. Okay, we have about 11 minutes, 10 minutes now. I've talked about building relationships with local self-advocacy chapters, and really important. I know that we want to invite people with disabilities and deaf people to the table, but when we do that, you really need to be prepared to provide them with a full range of supports to ensure their full participation. So it feels like y'all are a well-oiled machine and very organized group of people. But if you're going to invite like self-advocates to come and present to you, you've got to make sure that your space is accessible. You've got to make sure that your language is accessible. For many self-advocates, you're going to need to use plainer language, simpler language, so that they can fully understand. If you're asking questions, you got to just take a moment and try to put that question in the plainest, simplest possible way so that they can be fully supported. And then, you know, if you're inviting deaf people, make sure you have the American Sign Language interpreters. Captioning alone is not enough. And then, but I encourage you to begin the process of like really starting to build those relationships. So that many disability organizations have a value that 51% of their employees will be people with disabilities. So by virtue of building a relationship with a disability organization, you're likely going to be inviting people with disabilities to your table. So making sure that you're thinking about accessibility, and that's where we get to being proactive. You want to budget for accessibilities, for access. You want to know which organizations in your community can provide you with, like, can help you meet your accommodation requests. I mentioned Centers for Independent Living, but you also want to identify Braille houses to Edna's point, you know, if you're working with someone who is blind and is reading through Braille, then you want to be able to get your materials brailled. CART providers, it's just real-time captioning. AI captioning is fine when you're not working with somebody who's relying on it, but somebody who is really relying on captioning to be able to access your information. AI captioning is about 80% correct. So imagine, you know, I just did this. I made a video and I used the AI captioning in our video storage account. And I was showing the video and the captioning was just off. It was just really, really off to the point of absurdity. So keep that in mind, that you're, like, as much as possible, you want to use live captioners when people are relying on captioning. We mentioned policies. But you can also begin to integrate disability awareness into your existing trainings. So, like, if you do volunteer training or you have a staff orientation, if there's just standard training that you always have staff do, making sure that disability is part of that. And, pay attention to the attitudes of the staff, because those attitudes, like, it's an opportunity not to shame anyone, but it's an opportunity to be like, oh, we might need, a little more information about these things. And with that, we have 7 minutes if you would like to ask additional questions. And I'm gonna stop my PowerPoint soon, just in case there's questions coming through the chat and I'm missing them. I am seeing, Tara, a request that you save the chat before you log off, just FYI. I'm not seeing any questions, so should I turn it back over to you?
I think the comments are just saying that it was an outstanding presentation. So I wanted to echo that. This is Amelia Barilli-Simon with the Office of Violence Prevention. And as Claudia mentioned, she wasn't able to be here for the entire presentation. So I wanted to just offer to everyone our appreciation to you, Sandra, for sharing this excellent presentation, this important presentation, and also giving us food for thought. And also very clear action steps for how to address these barriers in our programs and how to look at policies that put victims who have disabilities maybe at greater risk, and how do we, that we may prevent them from accessing our services most effectively. And then the other takeaway that I personally got was how important it is to build these partnerships with various disability, deaf, hard of hearing communities so that we can improve our communication, information sharing, services, training opportunities. So this is a journey. And I know that, Tara has done such a wonderful job. This is our 4th in a series. And so just a reminder that we have so much to learn and so much to do, but there's hope. And through these partnerships and listening, we can really improve our services and support these survivors. So thank you so much, Sandra.
Thank you for having me. And thanks for everybody with all of the wonderful questions and the participation. It's really nice when people, I know that chat is not always the easiest way to participate, but it's lovely when people are able to engage a little bit with me. And I appreciate Tara and all of you so much for having us. And I will pop off. I don't know if y'all have other orders of business to attend to, but thank you everyone and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. And then just for quickly to close, we will email the DV Awareness Month flyers to the entire DV Council mailing list. If you're not on the list, I put my email in the chat, so you can ask for the flyers or also be added to the mailing list. So we will see you October 3rd, 11 o'clock at the Balboa Park Ballroom. And we'll also send the entire calendar of the regional events. And so we hope to see you there as well. Thank you, everyone.